Teresa Sievers, the holistic doctor locally popular for helping women with anti-aging, will forever be 46.
Several people said she was like the Oprah Winfrey of Florida, that she was that popular.
On June 28, 2015, Dr. Sievers returned home early from a family trip. Within hours, she was dead, attacked with a hammer, struck 17 times.
Florida sunlight has a way of making everything seem peaceful, even the places where dark things are about to happen. In Bonita Springs, a quiet suburb along the Gulf Coast, the streets were lined with palm trees and manicured lawns. It was the kind of place where people waved to each other in the mornings, where everyone knew the sound of their neighbor's car, where children played barefoot on cul-de-sacs under skies that looked too blue to ever hold a storm. It was here, behind a white fence and a front door painted coral pink, that Dr. Teresa Sievers lived, mother, wife, and healer, the kind of woman everyone seemed to admire at AT 46. She had the kind of energy that made rooms brighter when she entered. Patients described her as electric, her laugh infectious, her eyes always alive with purpose. She was more than a doctor. She was a believer in holistic health, in food as medicine, in the idea that the mind could heal the body. Her clinic in Fort Myers had become something of a sanctuary for people who felt unseen by traditional medicine. Women came to her not just for prescriptions, but for understanding. Men came because she listened. Families came because she made them feel that healing wasn't just chemical, it was spiritual. She was a doctor of light in a world that often felt dimmed at home, though the light flickered differently. Her husband, Mark Sievers, had been her high school sweetheart, a quiet, intelligent man, a systems analyst by trade, who often stayed behind the scenes while she shined. They had 2 daughters together, bright girls who adored their mother and filled the house with drawings and laughter. To the outside world, the Sievers family looked perfect, a successful doctor, a supportive husband, a beautiful home. But perfection, especially the kind displayed for others, often hides the cracks beneath. By 2015, those cracks were widening. Teresa had become the breadwinner, running a thriving medical practice, while Mark stayed home managing the business finances and taking care of the children. He told friends he was proud of her success, but others noticed the subtle tension, the way he flinched when she made decisions without consulting him, the quiet resentment that lingered beneath his compliments. They had grown apart, orbiting each other like 2 planets whose gravity no longer held. Teresa confided to close friends that she was worried about the marriage. They had seen a counselor. She wanted to fix things. Mark wanted control. Despite the stress, Teresa remained devoted to her family. She drove the familiar route down Interstate 75, streetlights flickering over the windshield, the digital clock glowing red on the dashboard. She probably hummed along to the radio, maybe thought about what she'd wear for work in the morning, maybe missed her girls sleeping up north. There was no reason to believe the world she was driving toward wasn't the same one she'd left a week earlier. By 11:45 p.m., the car pulled into the driveway of her Jarvis Road home. The neighborhood was still, every window dark. She unlocked the front door and stepped into the quiet house, the faint hum of the air conditioner filling the silence. Her heels clicked across the tile floor toward the kitchen, where the lights were off. What she didn't know was that 2 men were already inside, waiting. The next morning, when Teresa failed to show up for work, her office manager grew worried. It wasn't like her. Teresa was punctual to a fault, the kind of doctor who arrived before her staff and stayed after the last patient left. Phone calls went unanswered. Texts went unread. By midday, the concern turned to alarm. The manager called Mark, still in New York with the children, to tell him something was wrong. Mark, sounding calm but concerned, asked a neighbor to check on the house. When that neighbor walked through the open garage door, the smell hit first, metallic and heavy. He called 911 immediately. Deputies arrived minutes later, stepping into a scene that would haunt them for years. Inside the kitchen, Dr. Teresa Sievers lay face down on the floor, her skull crushed by repeated blows from a hammer. Blood had splattered across the walls and cabinets. There were signs of a struggle, overturned furniture, scattered papers, but nothing appeared stolen. Her purse was intact. Her jewelry was untouched. This wasn't a robbery. It was an execution. The news spread through Bonita Springs like wildfire. A beloved local doctor murdered in her own home. The community mourned and speculated. Who could do this to her? Patients brought flowers to the clinic. Her staff wept openly. Mark Sievers, still in New York, sounded distraught on the phone with investigators, his voice breaking as he said, "I can't believe she's gone." But behind the grief, detectives noticed things that didn't sit right. His tone was flat, his details rehearsed. When asked about her schedule, he was oddly precise. And when they informed him that there were no signs of forced entry, his reaction wasn't confusion or fear, it was silence. The investigation began to turn inward. They looked at her life, her friends, her marriage. What they found were contradictions. Teresa was known for preaching mindfulness and love, yet her private emails revealed stress, exhaustion, and hints of betrayal. She had told a close friend that she feared her husband might harm himself if she ever left him. In another message, she wrote that she sometimes felt like a prisoner in her own success. Detectives discovered that Mark handled all the family's finances, including her life insurance policies, several of them, totaling over $4 million. They learned that the couple had debts, that the practice was profitable but strained, and that Mark had been worried about what would happen to the girls if something ever happened to Teresa. He played the grieving husband for the cameras, holding his daughters during a candlelight vigil and thanking the community for its support. But investigators noticed his lack of urgency in demanding justice. He didn't call daily for updates. He didn't ask about suspects. Instead, he spoke often about how life had to go on. The break came weeks later, a whisper from hundreds of miles away in Missouri. Detectives there had picked up chatter about a man bragging that he'd been paid to handle a job in Florida. The man's name was Curtis Wayne Wright Jr., a computer technician with a criminal record, and, as it turned out, Mark Sievers' oldest friend. They had grown up together, attended each other's weddings, shared family photos. Wright even looked eerily similar to Mark. Same beard, same build. Almost like brothers. Phone records showed contact between them in the days leading up to the murder. Mark claimed it was business, but when investigators pulled Wright's phone logs, they found something else, a series of calls and texts to a man named Jimmy Rodgers, an ex-con nicknamed the Hammer. That was when the pattern snapped into focus. Two men had driven from Missouri to Florida, their phones pinging along the route. They arrived the same day Teresa returned home. They left the next morning. And on that night, a woman was bludgeoned to death with a hammer. Detectives tracked down Rodgers first. He was cocky, defiant, and stupid enough to brag. He told people he had made good money on a Florida job. When police searched his phone, they found photos of him in a car wearing a work jumpsuit, flexing, and captioning the image, "Hammer Time." The web was tightening, but still, the question loomed, who wanted Teresa Sievers dead? The answer, investigators realized, was waiting back in Bonita Springs, in the man who had smiled through his wife's funeral and told his daughters that mommy's in heaven. Detectives had learned long ago that evil rarely announces itself. It hides behind normal things, texts, errands, family photos. When the evidence in Dr. Teresa Sievers' case began to point toward two men from Missouri, the theory that her killing had been random disintegrated. Random murders don't come with GPS coordinates. They don't come with friendship ties or matching phone records. They don't come with planning. This one did. In August 2015, 6 weeks after the murder, Missouri deputies knocked on the door of Curtis Wayne Wright's home. They expected resistance. Instead, they found a man who looked worn down by his own secrets. Curtis Wright was 47, balding, heavy-set, with a beard and quiet demeanor that mirrored Mark Sievers so closely that even detectives did a double take. He greeted them politely, feigned confusion, then folded almost instantly when they presented the data, cell tower pings, license plate reader images, and the faint but unmistakable scent of guilt. He didn't deny driving to Florida. He didn't even try. But at first, he said the trip was innocent, helping a friend move some stuff, he called it. When pressed, he claimed not to remember dates, but the details started to betray him. His phone had pinged near Bonita Springs the very night Teresa was killed. His rental car GPS showed the same. The coincidence was too sharp. Within hours, he was under arrest. The same day, detectives picked up Jimmy Rodgers in Hillsborough, Missouri, a wiry man in his mid-20s with tattoos, a swaggering gait, and a criminal record stretching back to petty thefts and bar fights. He was the type of man who mistook recklessness for bravery. When agents told him they were investigating a homicide, he smirked and said, "Which one?" They found the photograph almost immediately. Rodgers in a white jumpsuit, posing in front of a car with a caption scrawled in bold letters, "Hammer time." When news of the arrests broke, Bonita Springs gasped again. Two out-of-state strangers now stood accused of slaughtering their beloved doctor. But the question still clawed at everyone. Why? Who sent them? Why Teresa? The answer came in fragments, falling into place like bones rebuilding a skeleton. Curtis Wright had once been Mark Sievers' best friend, not just a casual companion, but a lifelong brother. They had grown up together in Missouri, godfather to each other's children, confidants through marriage and career. They talked often, sometimes daily. Teresa had known him too, even attended his wedding just months earlier. When detectives compared Mark and Curtis's phone records, the lines of connection were impossible to ignore. Calls before the murder, silence during it, and calls immediately after. When Curtis Wright finally cracked under interrogation, his words shifted the case forever. He didn't try to justify what he'd done. He didn't even try to deny it. He confessed, slowly at first, haltingly, and then in full, like a dam breaking. He told detectives that Mark Sievers had hired him to kill his wife. The room went quiet when he said it. Even seasoned investigators felt the air change. Wright explained that Mark had called him weeks before the murder, panicked and emotional. He said his marriage was falling apart, that Teresa wanted to leave him, that he'd lose custody of his daughters. "She controls everything," Mark had said. "The money, the practice, the house. If she leaves, I have nothing." But it wasn't fear that haunted his voice. It was rage. He told Wright that Teresa was planning to divorce him, that she might take the children, and that his life would be over. He wanted a solution, one that would fix everything. At first, Wright thought he was just venting. But then Mark called again, this time with details. He said he'd pay. He said he'd make it look like a robbery. He even gave instructions for when to strike. The night she'd fly back from New York alone. The story spilled out like a nightmare rendered in slow motion. Wright admitted that he had enlisted Jimmy Rodgers to help, promising him a share of the payment. They rented a car, packed hammers, gloves, and GPS directions, and drove more than 1,000 miles from Missouri to Florida. Along the way, they joked, smoked, and talked about the plan like two men on a business trip instead of a death mission. When they arrived in Bonita Springs, they parked several streets away from Teresa's house, waiting for the right moment. They broke in while she was still in New York, disabling alarms and positioning themselves in the dark. For more than a day, they waited in silence inside the house, listening to the hum of the air conditioner, the ticking clock, the sound of distant rain. They ate from convenience store bags, took turns napping on the floor. And when Teresa finally came home late that Sunday night, she didn't stand a chance. According to Wright's testimony, Teresa barely had time to turn on the kitchen light. She set down her bag, called out, and was struck from behind. She screamed once. Rodgers hit her again and again, the hammer cracking bone, splattering walls, ending everything in seconds. Wright claimed he never swung the weapon, that he just stood there. But his fingerprints on the doorframe and his DNA on a paper towel told a more complicated story. Afterward, they wiped what they could, fled the scene, and drove straight back to Missouri, tossing the hammer into a wooded area along the way. Mark had promised to pay once it was done. Wright said the money never came. He said it wasn't about money, Wright told detectives. He said it was about keeping his family together. That sentence chilled everyone who heard it. The plea deal came quickly. Wright agreed to cooperate fully, to testify against Rodgers and Mark Sievers in exchange for a reduced sentence of 25 years. It was a deal that would save his life and end another's. When Mark learned of the confession, he played the part he'd been rehearsing since the night of the murder, the bewildered victim of circumstance. He told reporters he was devastated that his best friend would accuse him of such a thing. He cried on cue, told investigators that Curtis was lying to save himself. But the evidence was too sharp to dull. Phone records placed him in near constant contact with Wright before and after the murder. Surveillance footage showed him at Walmart buying burner phones. The life insurance documents, signed weeks before the killing, bore his signature. And the most damning piece, GPS data showing that Wright had received the address, layout, and alarm code for the Sievers home directly from Mark's own device. when the arrest warrant was issued in early 2016. The same community that had once embraced him as the grieving husband watched deputies lead him away in handcuffs. Some wept. Others whispered that they had seen it coming. But everyone agreed on one thing. The betrayal was almost too cruel to understand, because this wasn't just a husband who had plotted to kill his wife. This was a man who had asked his best friend to do it for him. The trials that followed would drag every hidden truth into daylight. The courtroom would become a theater of greed, guilt, and manipulation. The words "for love" would twist into "for money." The family that once stood as a symbol of community would become a cautionary tale of how perfection can rot from the inside. But in that moment, as detectives watched Mark Sievers led into custody, the story that had begun as a mystery ended with something worse than shock. It ended with understanding. The knowledge that the person Teresa trusted most had orchestrated her death down to the minute, and had sent her to her grave with a kiss goodbye before she boarded her last flight home. The courthouse in Lee County, Florida, became a stage where love, betrayal, and greed were laid bare. The marble halls that once echoed with routine hearings now trembled with the whispers of a community desperate for answers. Cameras lined the street, news anchors rehearsed live reports, and strangers camped outside to secure seats inside the gallery. Everyone wanted to see the face of the man accused of orchestrating one of the most calculated murders in Florida's history, Dr. Teresa Sievers' husband, Mark Sievers. The trial wasn't just about evidence. It was about emotion, about how a man who spoke in the language of love could write the blueprint for death. Prosecutors described Mark as the architect, the cold mind who built the plan, convinced his best friend to execute it, and almost got away with it. They told the jury that behind his soft-spoken demeanor was a manipulator who used loyalty like a leash. But before Mark's trial could even begin, the courtroom drama of his co-conspirators unfolded first in 2019. Jimmy Rodgers sat before a different jury, defiant, restless, and unwilling to admit guilt. Unlike Wright, he refused to make deals. He insisted he hadn't been in Florida, that he knew nothing about a murder. But the state had more than words. They had his GPS data, his texts, his own bragging photographs. The picture of him posing in a white jumpsuit, flexing next to a car with the caption "Hammer Time," played on the courtroom screen like a grotesque joke. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Prosecutors painted Rodgers as the hired muscle, impulsive, greedy, but efficient. They described the two men's drive from Missouri to Florida as a road trip of death, detailing gas station receipts and toll records that mapped their exact path. The jury heard how they'd broken into the Sievers' home days before, how they'd cut the alarm system, how they'd waited in the dark for Teresa to return. When the photographs of the crime scene were shown, several jurors looked away. Teresa's blood had splattered across her kitchen walls in arcs that told their own silent story, the story of a woman ambushed in her own home, fighting for her life against a weapon that belonged to her husband's plan. The medical examiner's report described 17 blows to the head, each one more vicious than the last. Her skull had been shattered. It was overkill, the kind that speaks of rage, not robbery. Curtis Wright took the stand next. Shackled and dressed in prison khakis, he spoke quietly, methodically, with the detached tone of a man who had already cost him freedom. Now it cost him the last of his pride. When the verdict for Jimmy Rodgers was read, the courtroom held its breath. He was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. His expression barely changed. He looked straight ahead as if the verdict had been expected all along. But the real spectacle was still to come. The trial of Mark Sievers, November 2019. For years after the murder, the man once seen holding his daughters at candlelight vigils now stood accused of planning their mother's death. He entered the courtroom wearing a crisp suit, hair neatly parted, eyes expressionless. Behind him sat rows of reporters, true crime enthusiasts, and members of the Sievers family, some there for closure, others to understand how love could mutate into something this dark. The prosecution opened with quiet precision. This case, the lead prosecutor began, is about control. It's about a man who wanted to dictate every part of his wife's life. And when he couldn't, he decided to end it. They played recordings of Mark's interviews with detectives, his calm voice, his insistence that his marriage had been fine, his odd detachment when discussing Teresa's death. "We had our ups and downs," he said at one point. She was very strong-willed. The phrase strong-willed echoed through the courtroom like a confession of resentment. Then came the text messages, hundreds of them between Mark and Curtis Wright. They were filled with coded phrases about handling things, about timing, about loyalty. In one exchange, Mark had written, "We need to take care of it before she takes everything." When questioned, he claimed the texts referred to business matters, but the jury didn't buy it. Wright's testimony returned for the final blow. He stood before the same man who had been his best friend and told the court. He wanted her dead. He planned everything. He told me when she'd be home, where to wait, what to do. He pointed directly at Mark and said, he was the boss. The courtroom fell silent. Mark stared straight ahead, his jaw tight, his hands clasped, refusing to meet Wright's eyes. The defense argued that Curtis Wright was framing Mark to save himself, that there was no direct proof of payment, no paper trail. They painted Wright as the real mastermind, a criminal using friendship as a shield. But the mountain of circumstantial evidence was too tall. The jury didn't need a bank receipt to see the pattern. The most heartbreaking testimony came from Teresa's family. Her mother sobbed as she described her daughter's compassion, her joy, her belief in helping others. She healed people, she said. She believed love could fix anything. She trusted Mark because she loved him. Those words cut through the courtroom like a blade. When the defense rested, Mark Sievers himself took the stand, against his attorney's advice. His voice was calm, controlled, even rehearsed. He said he loved his wife deeply, that he was being punished for trusting the wrong person. Curtis lied, he said. I would never hurt Teresa. She was my world. But as he spoke, something about his tone, that flat, affectless composure, worked against him. Jurors later said it felt like he was reading from a script written for someone else. The prosecution's closing argument was short and devastating. You can't hire loyalty, the prosecutor said. You can only buy silence. And his best friend finally stopped being silent. When the jury returned, they had deliberated less than 4 hours. Mark Sievers stood as the verdict was read, guilty of first-degree murder, guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. Gasps filled the room. He closed his eyes for a moment, then exhaled, still expressionless. His mother cried in the back row. Teresa's family held hands, but the trial wasn't over. In Florida, a guilty verdict in a capital case brings one more question: life or death. The penalty phase was brutal. The prosecution reminded the jury of the planning, the betrayal, the brutality of the crime. They showed photos of Teresa smiling with her daughters, the same daughters who would now grow up with a father sentenced for killing their mother. If this isn't a case for the ultimate punishment, the prosecutor said, what is? The defense pleaded for mercy, saying Mark's daughters still loved him, still visited him, still needed a father alive. But in the end, the jury spoke for Teresa. Death, the judge agreed. On January 3, 2020, Mark Sievers was formally sentenced to death by lethal injection. He showed no emotion. The judge's words were heavy. The evidence shows that you are manipulative, cold, and calculating. You destroyed the very family you claimed to protect. Outside the courthouse, Teresa's family embraced. After nearly 5 years, justice had a name. The courtroom emptied slowly that day, as if no one wanted to be the first to leave the room where evil had finally been named. The air carried the weight of everything that had been said, the photographs, the testimonies, the words death penalty. Teresa's family lingered in the benches, arms wrapped around each other, tears mixing with exhaustion. For them, justice wasn't triumph. It was survival. For years they had lived under the shadow of the unanswered question, why? Now they knew the answer, and it was worse than they imagined. Outside, the Florida sun shone like it always did, oblivious. Reporters swarmed, their microphones catching the trembling voices of relatives, thanking investigators and prosecutors. We finally have peace, one said. But peace, everyone knew, was a complicated word. For Mark Sievers, the man who had once seemed mild and thoughtful, life shrank to the size of a cell. He was transferred to Florida State Prison in Rayford, where death row occupies a separate, heavily guarded wing. The man who used to manage schedules and payrolls now lived by someone else's clock. He spent 23 hours a day in isolation, a thin mattress, a metal sink, and the distant echo of voices that were never close enough to touch. In interviews before the sentence, He had insisted on his innocence. Even after the jury's decision, he kept repeating the same words. I didn't do this. I was framed. But those words sounded smaller now, swallowed by the walls. Prison officials described him as quiet, disciplined, almost robotic. He read constantly, mostly legal documents and religious texts. Some inmates said he spent hours writing letters that no one ever received. Letters to his daughters, letters to Teresa, letters to no one. His daughters were still young when the verdict came. They had watched their mother's funeral in confusion, their father's arrest in disbelief. For years they had been shielded by relatives who tried to preserve what little innocence they had left. As they grew older, they began to understand. One day, they would have to choose how to remember their parents, not as victim and murderer, but as two people whose love story had turned fatal. Teresa's family fought for custody, wanting to protect the girls from the stain of their father's choices. It was a slow, painful process. Letters from Mark arrived sporadically, carefully worded, emotional, filled with the kind of love that comes too late. The girls, guided by therapists and relatives, responded only through official channels. Somewhere between those letters and the silences between them lay the fracture of a family that could never be whole again. In Missouri, Curtis Wayne Wright began his 25-year sentence. The man who had once been the best friend, the godfather, the trusted confidant was now the state's most infamous witness. His plea deal had spared him life in prison, but not the burden of memory. Fellow inmates said he rarely spoke of the case. When he did, it was brief, a shrug, a sigh, a whispered, "It wasn't supposed to be like that." He knew that his testimony had put his oldest friend on death row. He also knew that he had helped build the plan that killed a woman who had once trusted him enough to dance at his wedding. He spent his days working in the prison library, his nights writing in spiral notebooks that filled his bunk. Some pages were confessions. Others were apologies no one would ever read. Time has a way of grinding people down, and by the second year, even his once defiant posture had faded. He'd been used, but he'd also been willing. That truth haunted him more than the bars ever could. And then there was Jimmy Rodgers, the youngest of the trio, serving life in a different facility. He was 30 when the sentence came, still arrogant, still grinning when the cameras flashed. But life inside a Florida penitentiary has a way of silencing even the loudest men. Within months, the bravado was gone. He became another face in the line at Chow, another inmate counting years that would never end. They called him Hammer there too, not out of respect, but as a reminder of the stupid nickname that had sealed his fate. He didn't talk much about Florida anymore. He just waited, a man who had traded a laugh for a lifetime. Outside those walls, Teresa's story refused to fade. Her clinic reopened under new management, her name kept on the sign. Patients still came, some of them old regulars who left flowers in the lobby once a year. Her mother spoke at conferences about domestic betrayal, about the invisible signs of coercive control, about how success and danger can exist under the same roof. Teresa believed in healing, she would say. Even now, through her story, she's still healing people. The people of Bonita Springs never forgot the shock of that summer. They remembered the candlelight vigil where Mark had held his daughters and cried for cameras. They remembered how his hands had looked steady even when his world was supposedly falling apart. In hindsight, everything about that night felt like a rehearsal. People still drive by the Sievers house sometimes, slower than usual, glancing at the window where the light used to glow late at night when Teresa was working on patient charts. The new owners remodeled, painted, replanted. But locals say there's something about that corner that feels different now. Years later, when documentaries and true crime series revisited the case, the interviews always came back to the same question. How does a man decide to kill the woman he once promised to protect? The experts talked about narcissism, financial strain, and the psychology of control. But those who knew Teresa said it was simpler. She had outgrown him. Her success had become the mirror in which his own failures stared back, and he couldn't stand it. So he decided to destroy the reflection instead. On death row, Mark Sievers aged quickly. The beard turned white, the hair thinned, the eyes dulled. The letters kept coming, to lawyers, to family, to his daughters, but the replies grew fewer. Sometimes he requested extra paper, sometimes he asked for new reading material about philosophy. Once, in a letter obtained by reporters, he wrote, "If I had died that night instead of her, the world would still believe in love." In 2023, his attorneys filed the usual appeals. The Florida Supreme Court upheld his sentence. His execution date remains unscheduled, but time in that corridor of waiting is its own punishment. Each morning begins with the same sound: the heavy boots of guards, the clank of food trays, the rustle of paper as inmates count their own years like currency. The story of Dr. Teresa Sievers became more than a case file. It became a parable about trust and betrayal, about how evil can wear the calmest face in the room. It was about a woman who gave everything to help others heal, only to be destroyed by the man who needed healing most. Her daughters, now teenagers, rarely speak publicly. When they do, it's usually in gratitude to the people who stood by them, the ones who carried them through the noise. They visit their mother's grave every year. The headstone is simple, engraved with words that echo who she was in life: healer, mother, light. They bring flowers, white lilies, her favorite, and stand together in silence. The world that once broke around them keeps spinning, but that small space remains still. The legacy of her murder changed how many saw domestic life, how people talk about hidden tension behind suburban doors. Neighbors pay more attention now. Friends ask harder questions. Therapists cite her story in talks about emotional control and financial manipulation. In a way, she continues to save people, not through medicine this time, but through memory. And in that, perhaps, there's a kind of justice that even the court couldn't grant. When darkness fell over Bonita Springs each night, the houses went quiet again, the streets glowed under streetlights, and the air smelled faintly of salt and orange blossoms. Somewhere beyond those lights, in a cell far away, Mark Sievers still breathed, still dreamed, still claimed innocence to a ceiling that never answered. Somewhere else, a friend named Curtis counted days he could never get back. And somewhere, two daughters grew into young women, learning that love can heal, but it can also destroy. In the end, that's what remained. A doctor who gave her life to others, a husband who took it away, and a story that warned the world that monsters don't always look like strangers. Sometimes, they look like family.